The morning of April 23, 1945, found the small German town of Herzberg shrouded in an eerie silence that seemed to swallow even the sound of footsteps on cobblestone streets. Smoke still drifted from the remnants of the local railway station, and the acrid smell of burned wood mingled with the sweet scent of apple blossoms from abandoned orchards. In basement cellars throughout the town, families huddled together, whispering prayers and clutching whatever precious belongings they could carry, convinced that their darkest fears were about to become reality. What they could not have imagined was that their liberation would come through the hands of men they had been taught to fear above all others, and that compassion would emerge from the most unexpected source. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the extraordinary account of how a single act of humanity between a German woman and an African-American soldier would shatter everything both had been told about the other, creating a bond that would endure long after the conflict ended. Sergeant James Washington of the 761st Tank Battalion had been rolling through the German countryside for 3 weeks, his Sherman tank crunching over debris-strewn roads that told the story of a nation in collapse. The 24-year-old from Birmingham, Alabama, had enlisted in 1942 with dreams of proving that African-American soldiers could serve their country with the same courage and dedication as any other fighting man. What he had not expected was that his most profound test would come not in the heat of combat, but in a moment of quiet humanity in a bombed-out German town. The 761st Tank Battalion was one of only 2 African-American tank battalions to see combat in the European theater, a fact that carried both pride and burden for every man who served in its ranks. These soldiers had fought not only against the German armed forces, but also against the prejudice and segregation that followed them across the Atlantic Ocean. They had proven themselves in the forests of the Ardennes during the winter offensive, their M4 Sherman tanks holding critical positions while German forces launched desperate counterattacks. Now, as they advanced into the heart of Germany itself, they carried with them the weight of representing their entire race in the eyes of both their enemies and their own countrymen. Washington's tank, nicknamed Sweet Caroline, after his girlfriend back home in Alabama, bore the scars of months of continuous operation. The olive-drab paint was chipped and faded, and the steel surface showed dents from small arms fire and shrapnel. Inside the cramped fighting compartment, the air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, gun oil, and the sweat of 5 men who had lived and worked together in a space smaller than most bathrooms. The radio crackled constantly with reports from other units, creating a symphony of military communications that had become as familiar as breathing. The approach to Herzberg had been unlike any other town they had encountered. There were no defensive positions, no hastily constructed barricades, no signs of organized resistance. Instead, white flags and bedsheets hung from nearly every window, creating an odd patchwork of surrender that fluttered in the spring breeze. The silence was so complete that Washington could hear the ticking of cooling metal from the tank's engine as they rolled to a stop in the town square. "This place gives me the creeps, Sarge," said Private First Class Tommy Martinez, the tank's loader, as he peered through the periscope. "Too quiet. Feels like a trap." Washington understood his concern. They had learned through bitter experience that German forces often used seemingly abandoned towns as ambush sites, allowing American units to advance before opening fire from concealed positions. But intelligence reports had indicated that the German armed forces in this sector had withdrawn completely, leaving only civilian populations behind. The mission was clear: secure the town, ensure there were no remaining military assets, and establish a temporary command post for the advancing infantry units that would follow. As Washington climbed out of the tank commander's hatch, the spring air hit his face with a freshness that seemed at odds with the destruction surrounding them. The town square, which would normally have been bustling with market activity on a Thursday morning, was completely deserted, except for a few scattered belongings that told the story of hasty evacuation. A child's wooden toy horse lay on its side near the fountain, and newspapers from the previous week were scattered across the cobblestones like fallen leaves. The buildings that surrounded the square showed the eclectic architecture, typical of small German towns. with half-timbered houses dating back centuries standing alongside more modern brick structures from the early 1900s. Many windows were boarded up or covered with heavy curtains, but Washington could sense eyes watching from behind those barriers. The feeling of being observed was almost tangible, like static electricity before a thunderstorm. Lieutenant Colonel David Williams, the battalion commander, had briefed all unit leaders on the importance of proper conduct during occupation duties. The African-American units of the United States Army were under constant scrutiny from both military leadership and war correspondents, and any incidents would reflect not only on individual soldiers, but on the capabilities and character of all African-American servicemen. The message was clear. They were to be professional, disciplined, and above reproach in all their dealings with civilian populations. The tactical situation was complex in ways that went far beyond simple military considerations. The German population had been subjected to years of propaganda that portrayed African-American soldiers as savage, uncontrolled forces who would show no mercy to German civilians. These messages had been particularly virulent in the final months of the conflict, as German leadership sought to motivate continued resistance by painting Allied occupation as a fate worse than continued fighting. The result was a civilian population that was terrified not just of military occupation, but specifically of what they believed African-American soldiers would do to them. Washington understood this dynamic all too well. He had read the intelligence reports that detailed the propaganda campaigns, and he had seen the fear in civilian faces in other towns they had liberated. But he had also seen how that fear could transform into something else entirely when people were treated with dignity and respect rather than the brutality they expected. The challenge was creating those initial moments of human connection that could bridge years of indoctrination and prejudice. The tank crew began their standard procedures for securing an area, with Martinez and Corporal Benjamin Benny Johnson establishing a perimeter, while Sergeant William Willie Davis remained with the tank to monitor radio communications. Private Charles Thompson, the youngest member of the crew at 19 years old, was assigned to begin a house-to-house search for any remaining military equipment or personnel. These searches were routine but required careful attention to detail, as German forces had become increasingly creative in their efforts to hide weapons and supplies. As Thompson approached the first row of houses, Washington noticed movement behind one of the upstairs windows. A curtain had moved slightly, just enough to suggest someone was watching their activities. He made a mental note to check that particular building personally, knowing that first contact with civilian populations often set the tone for everything that followed. The success or failure of occupation duties often depended on those critical first impressions. The house that had caught Washington's attention was a modest two-story structure, with green shutters and a small garden that showed signs of recent care despite the chaos of the preceding weeks. Rose bushes had been pruned back for winter, and the small vegetable plot showed evidence of spring planting that would now likely go untended. A wooden gate hung slightly askew on its hinges, and the brick walkway leading to the front door was swept clean, despite everything else that had happened around it. Washington approached the front door with the measured pace of a soldier who had learned to balance caution with the need to appear non-threatening. His M1 Garand rifle was carried in a ready position but not aimed, and he made sure his movements were deliberate and visible to anyone who might be watching from inside. He had learned that sudden movements or aggressive posturing often triggered panic responses that could escalate situations unnecessarily. The front door was solid oak with iron hardware that spoke of German craftsmanship and attention to detail. A small brass nameplate read Müller, and beneath it was a door knocker shaped like a lion's head that had been polished until it gleamed despite the circumstances. Washington raised his hand to knock, then paused as he heard the sound of hushed voices from inside. The conversation was in German, too muffled for him to make out specific words, but the tone was unmistakably one of fear and urgent consultation. When he finally knocked, the sounds from inside stopped immediately, as if every person in the house had suddenly held their breath. He waited 30 seconds, then knocked again, this time calling out in the limited German he had learned during training. "Amerikaner," he said, trying to make his voice sound as calm and reassuring as possible. "Wir sind hier zu helfen." The phrase, which meant, "We are here to help," felt awkward on his tongue, but he hoped the intention would come through despite his poor pronunciation. The silence that followed stretched for nearly a minute, and Washington was beginning to consider whether to try a different approach when he heard the sound of multiple locks being undone. The door opened just a crack, revealing a single brown eye peering out at him through the narrow gap. The eye darted quickly up and down, taking in his uniform, his rank insignia, and the color of his skin, before disappearing back into the darkness of the house. "Please," came a whispered voice in heavily accented English, "please don't hurt me." The voice belonged to a woman, probably middle-aged, and it carried a level of terror that went far beyond normal fear of military occupation. Washington could hear the trembling in those 4 words, and he realized that this moment represented everything he had been trained to handle with the utmost care and professionalism. His response would either confirm her worst fears or begin to dispel the myths and propaganda that had shaped her expectations. "Ma'am," Washington said, removing his helmet and holding it under his arm in a gesture of respect. "I'm Sergeant Washington with the United States Army. I'm not here to hurt you or anyone in your family. I just need to make sure there are no soldiers or weapons in your house, and then I'll be on my way." The door remained cracked for another long moment, and Washington could hear whispered consultation taking place behind it. Multiple voices were discussing something urgently in German, and he caught fragments that suggested there were several people inside, probably including children based on the higher-pitched voices he could detect. The conversation seemed to center around whether they could trust his words or whether this was some kind of trap designed to get them to open the door. Finally, the door opened wider, revealing a woman in her early 40s with graying brown hair pulled back in a simple bun. She wore a dark blue dress that had been mended in several places, and her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, as if she were trying to keep them from shaking. Behind her, Washington could see the edges of other figures pressed back against the walls of the entryway, trying to remain out of sight while still being able to hear what was happening. "I am Greta Müller," the woman said, her English careful and precise despite her obvious nervousness. "This is my house and my family. We have no soldiers here, no weapons. Please, we are only civilians." Washington nodded and smiled slightly, trying to project as much reassurance as possible through his body language. "I believe you, Mrs. Müller, but I still need to check just to make sure everyone is safe. It will only take a few minutes, and then you can go back to taking care of your family." The search of the house was thorough but respectful, with Washington carefully explaining what he was looking for as he moved from room to room. The Müller house was modest but well-maintained, with furniture that spoke of middle-class comfort before the privations of the final months of conflict. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece in the sitting room, showing happier times when the family had been complete and the future had seemed secure. As Washington examined the upstairs bedrooms, he began to piece together the family situation. There were clear signs that the household had recently included more people than were currently present. Men's clothing hung in wardrobes, but the sizes and styles suggested they belonged to someone who had been away for an extended period. A bedroom that clearly belonged to a teenage boy showed signs of hasty packing, with drawers left partially open and personal items scattered as if someone had gathered belongings quickly. Mrs. Müller followed him through the house, maintaining a careful distance, but watching his every move with the intensity of someone whose survival might depend on reading his intentions correctly. She answered his questions with brief, factual responses, providing information about the number of people in the house and confirming that no military personnel had been present for several months. Her English was good enough for basic communication, though she sometimes paused to search for the right word. "Where is your husband, Mrs. Müller?" Washington asked as they returned to the main floor of the house. The question caused her to pause, and for a moment her carefully controlled composure wavered. "He is, away," she said finally, "with the army. We have not heard from him since February." Washington nodded understanding. The German armed forces had suffered massive casualties during the final months of the conflict, and communication with individual units had become increasingly sporadic as command structures collapsed. Millions of German soldiers were either captured, missing, or had been forced into hasty retreats that separated them from their families. The uncertainty faced by families like the Müllers was one of the tragic realities that accompanied military occupation. "And your son?" Washington asked gently, having noticed the teenage boy's room. "Klaus is 16, Mrs. Müller replied. "They took him 3 weeks ago for the Volkssturm. He is just a boy, but they said all boys over 15 must serve." Her voice broke slightly as she spoke, and Washington could see the effort it took for her to maintain her composure. The Volkssturm had been a desperate final measure by German leadership, conscripting elderly men and teenage boys for last-ditch defensive efforts. Most of these hastily trained units had either been overwhelmed by advancing Allied forces or had simply dissolved as the military situation became hopeless. The fate of individual Volkssturm members was often unknown, leaving families to wonder whether their loved ones were captured, wounded, or worse. Washington completed his search of the house without finding anything that required official action. There were no weapons beyond a hunting rifle that Mrs. Müller readily showed him, properly stored and clearly intended for putting food on the table rather than military use. There were no hidden soldiers, no military equipment, and no signs that the house had been used for anything other than sheltering a frightened family trying to survive the final chaotic weeks of the conflict. As they returned to the main sitting room, Washington became aware that other family members were beginning to emerge from their hiding places. An elderly woman, probably Mrs. Müller's mother, peered around the corner from the kitchen, her white hair neatly braided despite the circumstances. 2 young children, a girl of perhaps 8 and a boy who could not have been more than 6, clung to their grandmother's skirts while staring at Washington with the wide-eyed curiosity that children maintain even in the most difficult circumstances. The dynamic in the room was complex and charged with years of propaganda and racial prejudice that had shaped everyone's expectations. Mrs. Müller had been taught to expect brutality and violence from African American soldiers, messages that had been reinforced through constant repetition in newspapers, radio broadcasts, and official pronouncements. For his part, Washington was acutely aware that his behavior would be seen as representative of all African American servicemen, and that any mistake could reinforce existing prejudices. But there was something else in the room as well, something that transcended the artificial barriers of race and nationality. It was the recognition of shared humanity that occurred when people looked beyond the uniforms and propaganda to see individuals dealing with the same fundamental concerns of survival, family, and hope for the future. Washington saw a mother trying to protect her children in circumstances beyond her control. Mrs. Müller saw a young man far from home, carrying out his duties with professionalism and respect rather than the savagery she had been taught to expect. "Mrs. Müller," Washington said as he prepared to leave, "I want you to know that my unit will be in this area for the next few days, making sure everything remains peaceful and safe. If you or your family need anything, medical attention, food, protection, you can find us in the town square. We're here to help, not to cause more problems." The offer seemed to surprise her, and she studied his face carefully, as if trying to determine whether his words were genuine or part of some elaborate deception. "You would help us?" she asked, "even though we are German?" Washington paused, recognizing the deeper question behind her words. She was asking whether he saw her as a human being deserving of assistance, or as an enemy deserving only of whatever minimal treatment was required by military regulations. His answer would either reinforce the propaganda that had shaped her expectations or begin to challenge the fundamental assumptions that had divided them. "Mrs. Müller," he said, "I see a mother trying to take care of her family during a very difficult time. That's the same thing I'd see if you were American or French or from any other country. People are people, regardless of where they were born or what language they speak." The impact of his words was immediate and visible. Mrs. Müller's carefully maintained composure finally cracked, and tears began to flow down her cheeks as she struggled to process the kindness in his voice. She had spent weeks, perhaps months, preparing for the worst possible treatment at the hands of occupying forces. To be treated instead with dignity and offered assistance was so far from her expectations that she seemed unable to fully comprehend what was happening. "I don't understand," she whispered. "They told us. They said American soldiers especially." She struggled with the words, clearly uncomfortable with the racial terminology she had been taught. They said you would show no mercy to German families. Washington nodded, understanding the propaganda she was referring to. They told you a lot of things that weren't true, Mrs. Müller, just like they probably told you that Americans were your enemies who wanted to destroy Germany and hurt German people. But look around. Are we destroying your town? Are we hurting your family? She looked around the room, taking in her mother and children, who were now standing openly rather than hiding, and she seemed to be processing the gap between what she had been told would happen and what was actually occurring. The cognitive dissonance was clearly difficult for her to reconcile, as it challenged not just her immediate expectations, but the entire framework of understanding that had shaped her worldview for years. "But why?" she asked. "Why are you being kind to us? We are your enemies." Washington considered his response carefully, knowing that this moment represented an opportunity to plant seeds of understanding that could grow long after his unit moved on to other assignments. "Mrs. Müller, ordinary people like you and your family were never my enemies. You didn't start this conflict, and you didn't choose to have foreign soldiers in your town. You're just trying to take care of your family and survive until things get better. I can respect that, regardless of what country you're from." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Washington's radio crackling to life. Lieutenant Williams was calling for status reports from all units conducting house-to-house searches, and Washington needed to respond with his findings. As he stepped outside to use his radio without alarming the family further, Mrs. Müller followed him to the doorway, watching as he reported that the Müller house was clear of military assets and posed no security concerns. "Sergeant Washington," she called softly as he finished his radio communication. When he turned back to her, she continued, Would you like some coffee? It's not real coffee, just made from acorns, but it's warm." The offer was significant in ways that went far beyond simple hospitality. Coffee had become a precious commodity in Germany during the final months of the conflict, and offering it to an occupying soldier represented a gesture of trust and goodwill that she could not afford to make lightly. More importantly, it represented a fundamental shift in how she was choosing to view him, not as an enemy to be feared, but as a person worthy of hospitality, despite the circumstances that had brought them together. Washington accepted the offer, recognizing both the significance of the gesture and the opportunity it presented for further breaking down the barriers between them. As they returned to the sitting room, he noticed that the atmosphere had changed considerably from when he had first entered the house. The elderly woman was now sitting openly in her chair by the window, and the children had moved closer, their natural curiosity beginning to overcome their initial fear. The coffee was indeed made from acorns, with a bitter taste that bore little resemblance to the real thing, but Washington drank it gratefully while engaging in careful conversation with the family. Mrs. Müller asked hesitant questions about America, clearly struggling to reconcile the propaganda she had absorbed with the reality of the man sitting in her living room. She had been taught that American society was violent and chaotic, but Washington's calm demeanor and respectful behavior suggested a different reality entirely. "Is it true," she asked carefully, "that in America, people of different backgrounds live together peacefully?" Washington smiled ruefully, recognizing the complexity of the question and the careful way she had phrased it to avoid using language that might be offensive. "It's complicated, Mrs. Müller. America isn't perfect, and there are definitely problems that need to be worked out. But yes, people from many different backgrounds live and work together, and most of the time we get along just fine." He decided to share something personal, sensing that it might help her understand the broader context of his presence in her living room. "I'm from Alabama, in the southern United States. Before the conflict, I worked in a factory that made airplane parts. Most of my co-workers were white, and we worked together every day to build the same planes that are now helping to end this conflict. We didn't always agree on everything, but we respected each other as people trying to do good work." The image seemed to fascinate her, probably because it contradicted so much of what she had been told about racial relations in America. The propaganda she had absorbed had emphasized division and conflict, But Washington was describing cooperation and mutual respect. The disconnect was clearly challenging her to reconsider other assumptions she had made about American society and the people who made up the American military. As their conversation continued, other family members gradually joined in. The elderly woman, who was indeed Mrs. Muller's mother and was named Anna, shared that she had relatives who had emigrated to America before the first great conflict. She had lost contact with them decades ago, but had always wondered about their fate in the new country. The children, emboldened by the adults' example, began asking innocent questions about American children and whether they played the same games. The transformation in the room was remarkable to observe. Fear and suspicion were gradually being replaced by curiosity and tentative friendship, as both sides discovered that the other was far more human and relatable than they had expected. Washington found himself genuinely enjoying the conversation, despite the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. The Muller family was intelligent, warm, and clearly devoted to each other, qualities that transcended national boundaries or political differences. The peaceful atmosphere was suddenly disrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching the house, followed by voices calling in English. Washington recognized the voice of Private Thompson, who was apparently looking for him to report on his progress with the house-to-house searches. The sound of American soldiers outside caused an immediate change in the family's demeanor, as they were reminded that their current situation was temporary and dependent on the goodwill of occupying forces. "Sergeant Washington," Thompson called from outside, "Lieutenant Williams wants to see you back at the command post." Washington stood to leave, but before he could reach the door, Mrs. Muller caught his sleeve gently. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "will you come back? I mean, if your duties permit." The request surprised him, both because of what it revealed about how dramatically her opinion of him had changed, and because of his own realization that he genuinely wanted to maintain contact with this family. In the space of a few hours, they had moved from mutual suspicion to something approaching friendship, and he found himself curious about their welfare as the town adapted to occupation and the eventual transition to peacetime. "If I can, Mrs. Muller," he replied honestly. "My unit's assignment here depends on a lot of factors I don't control, but if we're still in the area tomorrow, I'll try to stop by and see how you're doing." As he walked back toward the town square with Thompson, Washington reflected on the morning's events and their broader significance. The encounter with the Muller family represented exactly the kind of positive interaction that military leadership hoped would occur during occupation duties, but it also highlighted the complex human dynamics that existed beneath the surface of official policy. Real reconciliation between former enemies required individual moments of recognition and respect that could not be mandated through military orders or diplomatic agreements. The command post had been established in the town's former municipal building, a solid stone structure that had apparently served as the center of local government for decades. Lieutenant Williams had appropriated the mayor's office for his temporary headquarters, and maps of the surrounding area were spread across every available surface. Radio operators maintained constant contact with higher headquarters, coordinating the movement of supplies and personnel as the advance continued deeper into German territory. "Good work this morning, Sergeant," Williams said as Washington reported his findings. "Any problems with civilian cooperation?" "No, sir," Washington replied. "Most families are scared, but they're being cooperative. No sign of organized resistance or hidden military assets in any of the houses I checked." Williams nodded, making notes on a clipboard that contained reports from all the search teams. "The situation here seems pretty typical for this stage of the advance. Civilian population is mostly compliant, infrastructure is largely intact, no significant security concerns. We'll probably be moving on to the next objective within 48 hours. The timeline meant that Washington's promise to check on the Muller family would likely be kept. But it also meant that whatever relationships had been established with local civilians would be brief and transitional. The rapid pace of military operations left little time for the kind of sustained interaction that might lead to lasting changes in attitude or understanding. Yet even brief encounters could have profound effects, as Washington had witnessed that morning. The rest of the day was occupied with routine occupation duties, establishing security checkpoints, coordinating with military police units, and processing the paperwork that accompanied any interaction with civilian populations. Washington found himself thinking frequently about the morning's conversation with Mrs. Miller, particularly her questions about American society and race relations. Her curiosity had been genuine, and her willingness to challenge her preconceptions had been remarkable given the years of propaganda she had absorbed. That evening, as the tank crew settled in for the night in a defensive position on the outskirts of town, Washington shared some of his experiences with his fellow soldiers. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion had all had similar encounters with German civilians, and their stories revealed a consistent pattern of initial fear giving way to cautious acceptance as people realized that African American soldiers were behaving with professionalism and discipline rather than the brutality they had expected. "It's crazy how scared they are at first," said Corporal Johnson, as they shared a meal of field rations. "You'd think we were monsters coming to eat their children, the way they react when they first see us." "Can't really blame them for that," replied Private Martinez. "From what I've heard, the propaganda here has been pretty intense about what would happen if American forces occupied Germany. Add in the racial angle, and they've been told some really terrible things about what to expect from us." Thompson, who at 19 was the youngest member of the crew, had been deeply affected by his interactions with German children during the day's searches. "The kids are the hardest part," he said. "You can see they've been taught to be afraid, but they're still kids, and they're curious about everything. Once they realize you're not going to hurt them, they start asking about America and whether we have children too." The conversation touched on the broader implications of their role as representatives of both the United States Army and African American capabilities. Every interaction with German civilians was being observed and evaluated, not just by military leadership, but by war correspondents and political figures who were watching to see whether integration of American forces would prove successful or problematic. The pressure to excel was constant, but it was also motivating for soldiers who understood that they were helping to shape the future of American military policy. Washington spent much of the night thinking about Mrs. Miller's questions and the responsibility he felt to provide honest answers about American society and race relations. Her curiosity about how people of different backgrounds managed to coexist peacefully was particularly poignant, given that he knew the reality was far more complicated than his brief explanation had suggested. The United States was indeed struggling with significant racial tensions and inequalities, but there were also examples of cooperation and mutual respect that contradicted the divisive propaganda German civilians had absorbed. The following morning brought news that the unit's advance would be delayed by at least 24 hours, while higher headquarters coordinated logistical support for the next phase of operations. This meant that Washington would have the opportunity to follow through on his promise to check on the Miller family, a prospect that pleased him more than he had expected. He found himself genuinely concerned about their welfare and curious about how they were adapting to the reality of occupation. When he approached the Miller house the next morning, the front door opened before he had a chance to knock. Mrs. Miller had apparently been watching for him, and her greeting was noticeably warmer than it had been during their first encounter. She invited him in immediately, and he was surprised to discover that the family had been preparing for his visit by gathering questions they wanted to ask about America and his experiences as a soldier. "We have been talking since yesterday about the things you told us," Mrs. Muller explained as she served more of the acorn coffee. "My mother remembered stories her family in America used to write before we lost contact with them, and we realized how many things we thought we knew about your country were probably not true." The conversation that followed was wide-ranging and revealed the depth of misinformation that had shaped German understanding of American society. Mrs. Mueller and her family had been told that American cities were chaotic and violent, that racial tensions made cooperation impossible, and that American soldiers were poorly disciplined and prone to brutality. Washington's presence and behavior contradicted all these assumptions, forcing them to reconsider their entire framework of understanding. "May I ask you something personal?" "Mrs." Mueller said hesitantly, "do you have family in America? A wife, children?" Washington nodded, pulling out a worn photograph from his wallet that showed him in civilian clothes standing next to a young woman in a blue dress. "This is Caroline," My girlfriend back home in Birmingham. We're planning to get married when I return from overseas." The photograph was passed around the family with great interest, and Mrs. Miller studied it carefully before commenting. "She's very beautiful. Are you worried about her while you're away?" "Every day," Washington admitted. "She's working in a defense plant now, making ammunition for the military. It's dangerous work, and I worry about her safety just like she worries about mine. But we write letters as often as we can, and we're both looking forward to building a life together when this conflict is over." The revelation that he had someone he loved waiting for him at home seemed to complete the transformation in how the family viewed him. He was no longer an abstract representative of occupying forces or a symbol of racial propaganda, but a young man in love who was separated from his girlfriend by circumstances beyond his control. The universal nature of that experience transcended all the artificial barriers that had initially divided them. Anna, Mrs. Muller's mother, suddenly spoke up with a question that had apparently been troubling her. "In America, are you allowed to marry who you choose? I mean, can people of different backgrounds marry each other if they want to?" The question touched on one of the most sensitive aspects of American racial relations, and Washington knew that his answer would require careful consideration. "It's complicated, Mrs. Anna. In some parts of America, yes, people can marry whoever they choose regardless of background. In other parts, there are laws that prevent certain marriages. It's one of the things that needs to change as our country grows and improves." His honest acknowledgement that America had significant problems seemed to increase rather than decrease the family's respect for him. They appeared to appreciate his willingness to admit that his country was not perfect, and it made his positive descriptions of American society more credible rather than less so. The conversation revealed a sophisticated understanding that all societies struggled with questions of equality and justice, and that progress required honest acknowledgement of problems rather than denial of their existence. As the morning progressed, Washington found himself sharing more personal details about his life and background than he had expected. He told them about growing up in Alabama, about his family's struggles during the economic hardships of the 1930s, and about his decision to enlist despite knowing that African American soldiers faced discrimination and limited opportunities for advancement. The family listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that revealed their growing understanding of the complex realities that had shaped his experiences. The children had warmed considerably to his presence, and young Klaus, the 6-year-old boy, had begun showing Washington his collection of carved wooden animals that his grandfather had made before the conflict began. Each animal was crafted with remarkable detail and artistry, and Washington found himself genuinely impressed by the skill of the craftsman. When he complimented the workmanship, the boy beamed with pride and explained that his grandfather had taught him to carve simple shapes before being called away to military service. "Would you like to learn to carve?" the boy asked suddenly, offering Washington one of his grandfather's tools. The offer was touching in its innocence and generosity, representing a complete absence of the fear and suspicion that had initially characterized the family's reaction to his presence. Washington accepted the tool and allowed the boy to show him the basic techniques of wood carving, resulting in a crude but recognizable bird that delighted both the child and his sister. The simple act of creating something beautiful together seemed to cement a bond that transcended all the complex political and racial issues that had brought them together. Mrs. Miller watched these interactions with evident emotion, and Washington could see that she was struggling to reconcile the reality of his kindness with years of indoctrination about what to expect from American forces. "I must tell you something," she said finally. "When we first heard that American soldiers were coming to our town, I was terrified. Not just afraid, but convinced that we would be. That terrible things would happen to my family. The things we were told about what soldiers like you would do to German women and children. I spent weeks preparing for the worst." Washington nodded understanding, having heard similar admissions from other German civilians they had encountered. "What were you told to expect, Mrs. Muller?" She looked uncomfortable discussing the specific propaganda she had absorbed, but seemed to feel that honesty was important. "They said American soldiers had no discipline, no respect for civilians. They said that soldiers of your background would be especially brutal and would show no mercy to German families. They told us to hide our children and to expect that any women who encountered American forces would be hurt. The explicit acknowledgement of the racial propaganda made Washington angry, but he controlled his response carefully. "I'm sorry you were frightened like that, Mrs. Müller. It must have been terrifying to expect such treatment. But as you can see, the people who told you those things were lying to you. We're here to help establish peace and security, not to hurt innocent people." "Yes," she said quietly, "I can see that now. But I must ask you, why? Why did they lie to us about this? What purpose did it serve to make us so afraid?" The question was perceptive and touched on the broader strategies that both sides had used to motivate continued resistance and maintain morale among their populations. Washington considered his response carefully, recognizing that this was an opportunity to help her understand the mechanisms of propaganda and the ways in which ordinary people could be manipulated by those in power. "I think they wanted to make sure you would keep fighting rather than surrender," he said finally. "If you believed that surrender meant terrible treatment for your families, you might be willing to support continued resistance even when the military situation was hopeless. Fear can be a powerful motivator, even when that fear is based on lies." The explanation seemed to resonate with her, and she nodded slowly as she processed the implications. "So they sacrificed our peace of mind, our ability to trust others, just to make us more willing to continue a conflict that was already lost?" "That's how I see it," Washington confirmed. "The people who created those lies weren't the ones who would have to face the consequences of believing them. They were safe in their bunkers and command posts, while ordinary families like yours lived in terror of things that were never going to happen." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another American soldier, Private Thompson, who had been sent to locate Washington for another assignment. As Thompson entered the house, Washington noticed the immediate change in the family's demeanor. While they had grown comfortable with him over the course of their conversations, Thompson represented the unknown, and their initial wariness returned as they tried to evaluate this new person. Thompson, for his part, was clearly surprised by the warm atmosphere he encountered. He had expected to find Washington conducting routine military business with a frightened German family, not engaged in friendly conversation while children showed off their toy animals. The disconnect between his expectations and the reality he observed was evident in his expression, and Washington realized that this moment represented an opportunity to demonstrate the positive effects that respectful treatment could have on civilian relations. "Mrs. Müller," Washington said, "I'd like you to meet Private Thompson. He's a member of my tank crew, and like me, he's far from home and missing his family." Thompson, following Washington's lead, removed his helmet and nodded respectfully to Mrs. Müller. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am. I hope Sergeant Washington hasn't been causing any trouble for you and your family." The comment was clearly intended as humor, but Mrs. Müller took it seriously. "Oh no," she said earnestly. "Sergeant Washington has been very kind to us. He has helped us understand many things we were confused about." Thompson's expression showed his surprise at this response, and Washington could see him reassessing his assumptions about German civilian attitudes. Like many American soldiers, Thompson had expected to encounter hostility and resentment from occupied populations, not gratitude and friendship. The reality was more complex than military briefings had suggested, with individual relationships forming that transcended the official dynamics of occupation and surrender. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Müller made a request that surprised both soldiers. "Sergeant Washington, would it be possible for you to return tomorrow? My mother has been cooking a special meal, and we would be honored if you and your friend could join us. It's not much, but we would like to show our appreciation for your kindness." The invitation represented a remarkable transformation from their initial encounter, when she had begged him not to hurt her. In less than 2 days, fear had been replaced by trust, suspicion by friendship, and propaganda by personal experience. Washington was genuinely moved by the gesture and eager to accept, but he also knew that his unit's schedule was unpredictable and that military duties had to take priority over personal preferences. "I'd be honored to join you if my duties permit, Mrs. Müller," he replied, "but I can't make any promises about timing, since we have to follow orders from our commanders about where we go and when." She nodded understanding, but Washington could see disappointment in her expression. The brief connection they had established was clearly important to her, perhaps representing hope that the future might hold possibilities for understanding and cooperation that seemed impossible just days earlier. Her disappointment reminded him of his own sadness at leaving behind people he had come to care about, a common experience for soldiers whose duties required constant movement and separation from those they encountered. As they walked back toward the command post, Thompson peppered Washington with questions about his interactions with the Mueller family. "Sarge, how did you get them to open up like that? I've been doing house searches all week and most families barely say 2 words to me. They answer questions and that's it." Washington considered the question carefully, recognizing that his approach to civilian interactions had developed through trial and error over months of similar encounters. "I think it starts with treating them like people instead of like problems to be managed," he said finally. "Everyone we encounter has their own story, their own fears and hopes and concerns. If you can connect with those human elements instead of just focusing on the military mission, people usually respond positively." "But doesn't that take a lot of extra time?" Thompson asked. "I mean, we've got quotas to meet and reports to file. There's not always time for long conversations about family histories and personal experiences." The question highlighted one of the fundamental tensions in occupation duties between efficiency and effectiveness. Military schedules demanded rapid completion of assigned tasks, but building positive relationships with civilian populations required time and patience that were often in short supply. Washington had found that investing extra time in initial encounters often paid dividends later, as families who trusted American forces were more likely to provide useful information and cooperation. But he also understood that not every soldier had the luxury of spending hours in conversation with each family they encountered. "You're right that it takes more time initially," Washington acknowledged, "but I've found that families who trust you are much more helpful with information and cooperation. And honestly, I feel better about what we're doing when I can see the positive impact we're having on people's lives." Their conversation was cut short by their arrival at the command post, where Lieutenant Williams was waiting with new assignment details. The advance toward the next objective had been moved up by 6 hours, which meant that all personnel needed to be ready to move out by dawn the following morning. The news meant that Washington would not be able to accept Mrs. Mueller's invitation for dinner, a disappointment that affected him more than he had expected. The evening was spent in final preparations for departure, with tank crews conducting maintenance checks and loading additional supplies for the next phase of operations. Washington found himself thinking frequently about the Mueller family and wondering how they would adapt to the arrival of a new occupying unit. He hoped that their positive experience with American forces would help them approach future encounters with greater confidence and less fear. As the tank crews settled in for their final night in Hertzburg, Washington made a decision that went beyond official military protocols but felt necessary from a human perspective. Using his personal writing materials, he composed a brief letter in his limited German, explaining that his unit had been ordered to move on and that he would not be able to return for the promised dinner. He thanked the family for their hospitality and kindness and expressed hope that their son Klaus would return safely from his service with the Volkssturm. Finding a local resident who was willing to deliver the letter required some effort, but Washington eventually located a teenager who was willing to carry the message to the Mueller house in exchange for a chocolate bar from his personal rations. The transaction felt inadequate as a farewell to people who had come to mean something to him, but it was the best he could manage given the constraints of military service and operational requirements. The advance resumed before dawn, with tank crews moving through the pre-dawn darkness toward objectives that remained classified until they were en route. As Sweet Caroline rolled through the sleeping town of Hertzburg, Washington caught a glimpse of the Mueller house, with its green shutters and small garden now returning to the peaceful anonymity of civilian life. He wondered if Mrs. Mueller was awake, listening to the sound of tank engines that marked the departure of the American forces, who had briefly transformed her understanding of the world. The next several weeks brought a succession of towns and objectives, each presenting its own unique challenges and opportunities for interaction with German civilian populations. Washington found that his experience with the Müller family had changed his approach to these encounters, making him more attentive to the human elements that existed beneath the surface of official occupation duties. He began to see patterns in civilian responses that reflected not just immediate fear or compliance, but deeper questions about identity, belonging, and the possibility of reconciliation between former enemies. In the town of Neustadt, he encountered a family whose teenage son had been wounded while serving with a German unit that had surrendered to American forces. The boy was recovering in a makeshift hospital established by American medical personnel, and Washington was able to facilitate visits between the family and their son that would not otherwise have been permitted under standard security protocols. The gratitude of the parents was profound, and their willingness to provide information about remaining German military assets in the area proved valuable for subsequent operations. In Weimar, he met an elderly professor who had opposed the German regime and had spent months hiding in his basement to avoid conscription into the Volkssturm. The man spoke excellent English and was eager to engage in philosophical discussions about democracy, human rights, and the prospects for rebuilding German society along more peaceful and inclusive lines. Their conversations continued over several days and provided Washington with insights into the intellectual opposition that had existed within Germany throughout the conflict. Each of these encounters reinforced the lessons he had learned during his time with the Müller family, that individual human connections could transcend political and racial boundaries, that propaganda lost its power when confronted with personal experience, and that the process of reconciliation between former enemies required patient investment in understanding and mutual respect. The cumulative effect of these experiences was to transform not only the German civilians he encountered, but also his own understanding of what American values could mean when applied consistently and with genuine commitment to human dignity. The conflict in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945, with the unconditional surrender of all German armed forces. For the men of the 761st Tank Battalion, victory brought not immediate return home, but rather extended occupation duties that would continue for months as Germany transitioned from military defeat to civilian governance under Allied supervision. The work was less dramatic than combat operations, but arguably more important for the long-term success of post-conflict reconstruction. Washington's unit was assigned to a sector that included several of the towns they had liberated during the final weeks of active operations, including Herzberg. When he learned that he would be returning to areas where he had previously served, his first thought was of the Müller family and whether they had survived the transition to peacetime. The letter he had left behind had been inadequate as a farewell, and he hoped for an opportunity to learn about their fate and to see how the community had adapted to the end of hostilities. The return to Herzberg came 6 weeks after the surrender, when Washington's battalion was assigned to establish a more permanent presence in the region as part of ongoing security and reconstruction efforts. The town had changed significantly in the intervening weeks, with displaced persons from throughout the region arriving to seek shelter and assistance from Allied forces. A tent city had sprung up on the outskirts of town, housing refugees who had been separated from their families during the final chaotic weeks of the conflict. The infrastructure of occupation had become more sophisticated as well, with established procedures for civilian administration, food distribution, and medical care. What had been improvised emergency measures during the initial advance had evolved into systematic programs designed to address the complex challenges of rebuilding a society that had been devastated by years of conflict and the collapse of its governmental structures. When Washington finally had an opportunity to visit the Müller house, he was relieved to find the family not only intact, but visibly healthier than they had been during their first encounter. Mrs. Müller answered the door with a smile of genuine pleasure, and her greeting was warm and immediate. The fear and suspicion that had characterized their initial meeting had been completely replaced by the comfort of renewed friendship. "Sergeant Washington," she exclaimed, "we received your letter, and we have been hoping you would return. Please come in. My mother has been cooking for days in anticipation of your visit." The interior of the house showed signs of improvement as well, with food supplies that had clearly increased since the establishment of regular Allied distribution programs. More importantly, the psychological atmosphere was dramatically different. Where there had once been tension and fearful whispers, there was now relaxed conversation and easy laughter. The children ran to greet him with the enthusiasm of old friends, and even Anna, the elderly grandmother, seemed to have shed years of worry and stress. "We have wonderful news, Mrs." Müller announced as they settled in the sitting room. "Klaus has returned. He was captured by American forces near Dresden and spent several weeks in a prisoner camp, but he was released last month when they determined he was too young to be considered a combatant." The return of her son had clearly lifted an enormous weight from Mrs. Müller's shoulders, and Washington could see the relief in her eyes as she spoke about their reunion. The boy had returned thinner and more serious than when he had left, but he was physically unharmed and eager to resume his education and his normal life as a teenager. His experience as a prisoner had been difficult, but not traumatic, as American forces had followed international protocols for the treatment of underage combatants. Klaus himself appeared later in the evening, and Washington was struck by how much the boy had matured during his brief but intense experience with military service and captivity. He spoke thoughtfully about his time with the Volkssturm and his treatment by American forces, expressing gratitude for the professionalism and humanity he had encountered even as a prisoner. His perspective provided valuable insights into the experiences of the thousands of young Germans who had been conscripted into last-ditch defensive efforts. "The American soldiers who captured us were very kind," Klaus said in careful English. "They gave us food and medical care, and they helped us write letters to our families. Some of the boys in the camp were angry and wanted to keep fighting, but I could see that the Americans were trying to help us, not hurt us." The boys' observations reinforced Washington's understanding of the importance of treating all people, including prisoners and former enemies, with dignity and respect. The positive treatment Klaus had received had clearly influenced his attitude toward American forces and his willingness to embrace the possibilities that peace might offer. His experience suggested that the approach Washington had taken with civilian populations could be equally effective with military personnel, who found themselves on the losing side of the conflict. The dinner that evening was a remarkable affair, featuring dishes that Anna had prepared using ingredients that represented a significant investment of the family's resources. The meal included roasted chicken, fresh vegetables from their garden, and even a small cake made with precious sugar and eggs that must have cost them dearly to obtain. The effort and expense represented by the meal spoke volumes about their gratitude and their desire to reciprocate the kindness they felt they had received. The conversation during dinner ranged widely, covering everything from Klaus's experiences as a prisoner to Washington's hopes for his own return to America and his eventual marriage to Caroline. Mrs. Müller asked detailed questions about wedding customs in America, and Anna shared stories of her own wedding 50 years earlier, creating connections across generations and cultures that would have seemed impossible during the dark days of active conflict. "Sergeant Washington," Mrs. Müller said as the evening drew to a close, "I want you to know that meeting you changed everything for our family. Not just our feelings about American soldiers, but our understanding of what is possible between people who are supposed to be enemies. You showed us that hatred and fear are not natural or inevitable, but are choices that people make." The comment touched Washington deeply, as it articulated something he had felt, but had struggled to express about their relationship and its broader significance. Their connection had indeed demonstrated that the artificial barriers created by propaganda and prejudice could be overcome through individual acts of kindness and respect. More importantly, it suggested that the process of reconciliation between nations might begin with personal relationships between individuals who were willing to see past the labels and categories that divided them. "Mrs. Müller," he replied, "meeting your family changed me too. It reminded me that underneath all the uniforms and politics and national differences, we're all just people trying to take care of our families and build good lives for ourselves and our children. When I go back to America, I'll carry the memory of your kindness with me, and I'll try to help other people understand that our former enemies are not our permanent enemies." The promise was one that Washington would keep in the years that followed. After his discharge from the Army in 1946, he returned to Alabama and married Caroline as planned. They settled in Birmingham, where Washington found work in the growing aviation industry, and Caroline continued her career in manufacturing. But the lessons he had learned during his service in Germany continued to influence his approach to race relations and community building throughout his life. In the post-conflict years, Washington became active in civil rights organizations and veterans affairs, consistently advocating for approaches that emphasized education, understanding, and patient relationship building rather than confrontation and division. His experiences with German civilians had convinced him that even the most entrenched prejudices could be overcome through individual acts of humanity and respect, lessons that proved valuable in addressing the racial tensions that continued to plague American society. The correspondence between Washington and the Mueller family continued for many years after the conflict ended. Letters crossed the Atlantic regularly, sharing news of marriages, births, career changes, and the gradual reconstruction of both personal lives and national societies. Mrs. Mueller's letters provided Washington with insights into the challenges of rebuilding Germany, while his responses offered perspectives on the civil rights movement and the ongoing evolution of American society. In 1953, Klaus Mueller emigrated to the United States with his new wife, settling in Detroit, where he found work in the automobile industry. The decision to leave Germany was influenced significantly by his family's positive impressions of American society, impressions that had been shaped largely by their interactions with Washington during and after the conflict. Klaus's successful integration into American society represented, in microcosm, the broader success of German-American reconciliation in the post-conflict period. The relationship between the two families became a source of pride and inspiration for both sides, demonstrating the possibilities that existed when people approached each other with openness and good faith rather than suspicion and hostility. When Washington's first child was born in 1948, Mrs. Mueller sent a handmade christening gown that became a treasured family heirloom. When Anna passed away in 1955, Washington and Caroline sent flowers for her funeral and a letter expressing their gratitude for her warmth and hospitality during that crucial period of reconciliation. The broader implications of their relationship extended far beyond the personal realm to touch on some of the most important questions of the post-conflict era. Their friendship provided concrete evidence that former enemies could become genuine allies, that racial prejudices could be overcome through personal experience, and that individual acts of kindness could have lasting effects on international relations. The example they set was not unique, but it was representative of thousands of similar relationships that formed the foundation for the remarkable transformation of German-American relations in the decades following the conflict. Washington's military service had lasted 3 years, during which he had participated in some of the most significant events of the 20th century. But when he looked back on those experiences in his later years, it was not the dramatic moments of combat or the historic significance of military victories that stood out most clearly in his memory. Instead, it was the quiet conversation in a German living room, the sight of a frightened woman gradually learning to trust, and the sound of children's laughter as they shared their carved wooden animals with a stranger who had become a friend. The transformation that had begun with Mrs. Mueller's whispered plea, "Please don't hurt me," had evolved into something far more powerful and lasting than either of them could have imagined at the time. It had become proof that the deepest divisions between people could be bridged through patience, respect, and the recognition of shared humanity that transcended all the artificial barriers created by politics, propaganda, and prejudice. The small German town of Herzberg returned to peaceful anonymity in the years following the conflict, its streets once again filled with the normal activities of civilian life rather than the machinery of military occupation. The fountain in the town square, which had been silent during those tense April days in 1945, resumed its gentle flow, and children once again played in its shadow without fear of artillery shells or enemy soldiers. The scars of conflict gradually healed, both in the physical landscape and in the hearts and minds of the people who had lived through those transformative events. But the memory of those brief days when understanding had replaced fear, when enemies had become friends, and when the future had seemed full of possibilities rather than threats, remained as a testament to the power of individual choice in shaping the course of human events. Mrs. Greta Miller and Sergeant James Washington had each made decisions about how to treat the other that transcended their training, their expectations, and their fears. In doing so, they had created something beautiful and lasting that would influence not only their own lives but the lives of their children and their children's children. Years later, when Klaus Miller's son asked about his grandmother's experiences during the conflict, Klaus would tell him about the day when a kind American soldier had knocked on their door and changed everything they thought they knew about their enemies and themselves. The story would be passed down through generations as a reminder that even in the darkest times, individual acts of courage and compassion could create light that would shine far into the future. For Washington, the memory of that first tentative conversation in broken English, followed by hours of patient explanation and growing understanding, remained one of his most treasured experiences. It had taught him that real victory was not about defeating enemies, but about transforming them into friends, not about proving superiority, but about recognizing equality, and not about imposing one's will, but about discovering common ground that could support lasting peace. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.